Joining us now is John Couch, the creator of Lisa, formerly with Apple, and now off doing quite a few things on his own. Welcome to Computer Chronicles, John. Gary?
Well, John, I mentioned earlier in the opening segment that the Lisa machine seems to be related to Smalltalk and the Xerox Star. I remember it's been over 10 years ago I went to Xerox PARC and saw a high-resolution display like this. Can you give us some idea what that genealogy is? How did we end up with a Lisa?
Well, it really goes back to 1978 when I joined Apple Computer and went to work with Steve Jobs in a group called New Products. Our job was very simply to define the new products or the personal computer of the 1980s, and we attempted at that particular time to address some of the concerns that we had in terms of the growth of the personal computer industry via the Apple II. One of them certainly was that we felt the machines were too difficult to use. It required a person to learn a new language, a command language, in order to use the machine, and there was very little integration amongst the applications. It was very difficult to take data from one application into another application, and those systems that were integrated what I call at the file level, where you could write information to a file and read that file into another application, but then again you were forced to go through the command interpreter, through the command language to learn how to use that system. We saw the Xerox work, a lot of us during grad school, like yourself, and came to the conclusion that we could build a personal computer, taking advantage of the new technology in terms of the bitmap display, replace the command interpreter entirely with a graphics language. In other words, emulating the way people work in an office rather than asking them to change the way they do things, and use that same user interface to provide the integration in terms of moving data from one application to another.
Hey everybody, I'm Ron with Ron's Computer Videos, and I want to thank everybody for taking a few minutes out of their evening and spending it with me. Let's get right to the interview. I've got a wonderful guest for you here this evening. He's a computer scientist, he's the father of the Lisa, and he's the former VP of Education for Apple, Mr. John Couch. John, how are you this evening?
It's a pleasure.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us.
No, it's my pleasure.
Yeah. No, I'm a huge fan. I love things. I'm somebody that was very lucky to grow up. We had Apple II machines in my schools, and just kind of as going on as a professional in the information technology. I work in higher education. We do a lot of stuff with Macs, but it's all those formative experiences that a lot of the people at home also share, with either having like an Apple IIgs at home as a kid or Macs, kind of in a writing lab or something at school. But folks love the machines. So thank you so much for everything you did to kind of, shepherd this hobby that we love so much.
Well, I think I was probably just in the right place at the right time,
Well, I'm glad you were there, sir. But let's kind of start. I want to make sure that everybody at home kind of knows, but John wrote this wonderful book that's called My Life at Apple and the Steve I Knew. This is great. You should check this out online. Pick up a copy or maybe find it at your local library. But John has a really great story in here about kind of him starting out as a professional in computer science and information technology and where it's taken him in his career. This is a very inspirational book. There's some wonderful stories in here. So this was a great read. So thank you, John. But one of the things you talk about kind of early on is how influential the Douglas Engelbart's Mother of All Demos is, and how that really kind of shaped and inspired people that were kind of coming out of these burgeoning sort of computer science programs. Like you are like one of those first people that came out of Berkeley with like a computer science degree. Do you want to maybe talk about your early days and kind of your education and how you ended up kind of working for HP?
Yeah, first and foremost, I was at HP and writing compilers, and I went home one Christmas and my dad was lamenting that he couldn't manage my mom's business, which was a women's health club. They didn't know when the subscriptions would expire and whether or not people were signing up because of the advertising or because my mom was just a great salesperson. And so, I made the mistake of saying, well, did you ever think about writing a program to manage your business? And he goes, well, I don't really know anything about it. Can you help me? And I said, well, we could go buy a Radio Shack we called Trash 80 in those days for about $699, I think it was. And so we did. We went down and bought a Radio Shack, brought it home, opened it up in the living room, and true story, a cockroach ran out. It was Texas, right?
Yeah.
And I was in California, and my mom said, get that thing out of my living room. So we set it up in the garage, and I wrote a basic program for him. Problem was, every time I came home from college, my dad had additional functionality that he wanted into the program. And I found myself, spending all my holidays in the garage. And so it prompted me to write a paper called Datagramming. And the idea was that the non-procedure oriented language, that someone like my dad could define his data and the relationships between the data, and the program would be generated. All right. And when I saw VisiCalc very early on in the game, I go, bingo, that's the first example of what I had written called Datagramming. And so I gave both Dan and Filestra and Bricklin, an Apple II, and they said, would you implement it on the Apple II? And, the rest was history for the Apple II, because it sold a ton of Apple IIs.
Yeah.
And then, when I joined Apple, Steve challenged me with, with saying, basically he said, I want you to design a machine for me that everyone in the world could use, and I think my first reaction was, wow, where's the book? Obviously there was no book. And well, can you point me to some research program where they're working on this? And he couldn't. And, I realized that for the first time in my life, I was being challenged with a problem whose answers weren't in the back of the book. And so I remember the datagramming concept, and I knew I had to get away from a file system and command line commands prompts. And so I was fortunate enough to go with Steve up to Xerox PARC and sort of see the rudimentary work that they had done with word processor and the mouse and the drop down windows. And I thought, okay, this is the direction of the company. Steve obviously and I agreed on that. And but I knew I needed a 16-bit computer, not an 8-bit computer, to run that type of a software. And the challenge, of course, was no one had ever written any applications for a graphical user interface. So it took us a few years, but eventually we sort of, like they say, we sort of flew the plane while we built it. And the challenge, of course, was when we came out, we had 6 or 7 applications, but we wrote all those applications before we could come up with the APIs that would empower the normal programmer to add value to the system.
Yeah, no, I recall that in the book, how it was very much it was like you fought really hard for the 68,000 just because of kind of the capabilities of that versus like a lot of other chips that were on the market at the time. It kind of represented that next generation of things, and how like you could write stuff for the 68,000 that just really wasn't possible kind of on like 8088 and other options at the time. So
well, if you think about it, the only people, the market size for the Apple II before VisiCalc was fundamentally those that could write in DOS and those who could write in BASIC. And I knew I needed some procedure-oriented high-level languages to encourage the programmers, at HP and other places. And I felt that the 68,000 was a much better vehicle to support, high-level languages.
Yeah. I was one of those kids that learned Pascal growing up.
Yeah.
So I completely understand. Versus doing something, it was one of those things where you'd have an instructor or somebody. These were business courses at the time. Now you actually have like real computer science
Yeah.
departments and all of that. But
Well, Pascal was the first high-level language we put on the Apple II.
mhm.
I made a deal with Ken Bowles down at UC San Diego for the rights to run UCSD Pascal on the Apple II. I had to design what we called the language card, which was nothing more than 16K of memory, so that we
Yeah.
could have 64K of memory. And
Mhm.
we had the first high-level language on the Apple II that I could now attract Fred Gibbons from HP, who did software publishing, to come over and write software for the Apple.
He's certainly a game changer, and I do remember, popping. I mean, even today, you can pop open a lot of Apple IIs that came from schools and things like that, and they'll have that Pascal card in there. So,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
they got a lot of use out of those, that's for sure. But um, you had talked about that it was sort of one of those things where it was because you jumped right into the Lisa stuff, which is super interesting. But I wanted to ask you just kind of about um, how you kind of came to work for Apple, because it's a really interesting story about Steve coming to you and kind of making that sales pitch.
Yeah.
But it seems like he used a little emotional sort of leverage on you too.
Well, my boss at Hewlett-Packard was Dr. Tom Whitney, and Tom was known for the first handheld calculator.
Mhm.
And he had his PhD from Iowa, I believe Iowa State, and Dr. Wendell Sanders, who was the hardware manager for the Apple II, was also a PhD from Iowa State. So Apple ended up hiring Tom as engineering manager.
Mhm.
And I think he saw right away maybe two needs that Apple needed. One was software. They only had two programmers at the time at Apple, and they came to school after high school got out, and they had written, two utilities. And I think the other thing was someone to work with Steve,
Mhm.
someone that Steve could respect. I did have the multiple computer science degrees. At that time, Steve didn't know a lot about software. He was more the hardware guy, and then he had WAS for that. And so he set up a luncheon at his house for me to meet Steve. And Steve was incredible. I mean, he shared his vision. And to this day, I make a distinction between vision and mission. The mission was pretty clear. He wanted to build one person, one computer. But the vision, the why he wanted to do it, is because he saw technology as changing our lives. And in the book, it says if I could put one computer in a school and one student found it, it would change their lives forever. And that was true, right? And you're probably the best example of that. So I met with Steve. He shared his vision, which originally came from the whole Earth catalog, it was a Scientific American article where they had measured the efficiency of motion for animals and man was disappointing down the line. But someone had the foresight to rerun the test with man riding a bicycle, which amplified their physical ability. So Steve saw technology as amplifying our creative ability, and that registered to me. And I knew, from my studies at Berkeley and the days that I sat in front of a $7.5 million computer, writing compilers, looking at the protests in the street, thinking, you guys think you're changing society. I'm sitting in front of what's going to change society. So I knew it was only a matter of time before, people would find a use for the personal computer. And if we had asked people in those days, do you want a personal computer? They would have said no. It's like the old story of Henry Ford. If I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse.
Right.
Not this whole new infrastructure and automobiles that had wood tires and that needed gas stations and insurance companies, and basically an ecosystem that needed to be built around that innovation. And that's kind of what we had to build. We had to build an ecosystem around the personal computer. I mean, it wasn't sold in stores. You know, there was no app store. There was no software development community. That all was part of being vice president of software.
Oh yeah. Well, and it's very much it's one of those things. It's kind of one of those famous Steve Jobs things, and one of those famous kind of Apple culture things where it's like you're not predicting the future, you're creating the future.
Exactly. Well,
You're
and you know,
making those things. They don't know what they want yet. They'll know
yeah,
when I
no,
tell them.
yeah. Well, what was interesting was, Steve immediately offered me the job, but he goes, the maximum salary in the company is $40,000.
Mhm.
No, and because I want people to join the company who share the vision, not who see it as an economic opportunity. So
Yeah.
I said, well, I've got 3 kids, and I need to think about that, because you're asking me to go from making 75,000 to 40,
Yeah.
and I said, let me think about it. And over the weekend, and he showed up at my house with an Apple II, put it on the kitchen table, and told my then 3-year-old son, Christopher, you can have this if your dad comes to work for me. And the TV did not go on that weekend, and that little guy did things on that computer that I didn't think a 3-year-old was capable of doing. So on Sunday night, when I said, hey, Chris, don't get too attached to this, because I may have to return it. And he looked at me and said, why, Dad? And I said, well, if I don't take the job, I need to bring it back tomorrow. And he looked at me and he goes, well, just say yes, Dad, And not only did it change my life, but it changed his life and every member of my family's life. Chris became he went to computer science. His daughter is a computer scientist. We now have 3 computer scientists, generations in the family.
That's awesome.
Every one of my sons and daughters are creative, because I think the Apple culture really fostered that, but it also fostered challenges. You were not afraid to fail. So they all have their own companies.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I know you've taken like I as someone who has worked like their entire career in higher education, you've taken a lot of jumps and leaps of faith and things, and it seems like it's very much paid off in terms of like personal fulfillment and just making a difference with a lot of these things. So I'm hats off to you for sure on some of those
Yeah,
things.
I
Re-
mean,
reading the book, it's yeah.
I learned a lot at Apple. Obviously, I was very fortunate that I made the decision to leave the physics department at UC Riverside and do a search for a computer science department and find Berkeley. We were so early in the game that there were no books, so we actually wrote our own books as graduate students. As an undergraduate, I got to teach a graduate course at Berkeley. So, as a teaching assistant, I made $52 a month, but as an acting instructor in the summer, I made $780 a month, and that was enough to pay my wife's and my way through college and grad school. And then HP was a good company to work for, to get a good solid base in terms of management. I was almost mentored a little bit by Bill Hewlett himself, who taught me, some really important lessons, particularly around the HP 35 calculator, because they did market research and it came back and said, don't build it. Nobody wants it. And Bill Hewlett said, well, I want it. And furthermore, I want it to fit in my shirt pocket.
Yeah.
And 9 months later, it was doing, I forgot how many millions of dollars in revenue. And the largest slide rule company in the world was out of business, because they thought they were in the slide rule business, not the computational business. And so when I met Steve and Steve didn't do market research, I go, okay, Steve gets it, he gets it. And then, the other lesson from Bill was more companies die from indigestion, not than starvation. Yeah. And Steve, turned that around and said, we take as much pride in the 8 things we don't do as the 2 things that we do. So, but I was glad to, after 5 years at Hewlett-Packard, you could kind of see your whole future there. It was nice to sort of get out of that world and into the craziness of Apple, when most people that were writing about the technology in those days didn't really understand Apple being based on a vision. They always wanted it as, what do you do? But if you think about Apple's vision, it's still the same vision to this day, but the products have changed dramatically.
Yeah.
And I think it was really Steve's ability to articulate the why that helped us hire people and build multiple products that changed people's lives.
Absolutely. I one of those big products when you got brought in, you talked about it earlier, the Lisa, and just how groundbreaking that was. It took a lot of those concepts and stuff that you guys saw on the Alto, and just kind of pulled that around and made it into something that people could, maybe not like for home users, but I know NASA and other
Yeah.
big companies
Yeah.
made huge investments in the Lisa and Lisa hardware and all of that, and
Yeah,
it's lived a second life, but maybe not in the way that you intended.
well, the goal of originally Apple was very functionally organized. Okay, engineering, software, marketing, manufacturing. When the Apple III failed, Mike Scott, who was president at the time, really didn't feel that why should it be my responsibility, and why it should be there should be a general manager. So he built divisions, and he created a division around the Lisa that was called the personal office system. So our market was not the home. Our market really was the Banks of America and places like that. And I'll never forget giving Sam Armacost, the president of Bank of America at the time, a demo. And he got on the phone and he called his wife and said, I want you to come into the office and see the first computer you'll ever be able to use. So that was, we were swimming upstream, if you will, because, original goal was $5,000. We didn't hit that. It was more like 10. Steve's original goal was 1,000, and it was more like 3. But it changed the industry. And as you know, you couldn't program on the Mac. You had to program on the Lisa and then download it into the Mac. And I think probably the only time I really disagreed with Steve was probably twice. Once when he wanted to run the Lisa, and the company just didn't think he had the experience. And then he, took over the Jeff Raskin's project, which had nothing to do with graphical user interface, and it started to do the home. And I said, well, let's make them compatible, so you could work at home, take a floppy, and bring it into work, and and let's make you take our languages and make a subset.
Yeah.
But he saw compatibility as the antithesis to creativity. So he did not want compatibility between the two products.
I remember the Canon finally released Jeff's design, the Cat. So it's an interesting word processor, but which was a big part of what businesses did at the time. But I don't know how that would have been like something that would have somehow been the future of Apple. Having seen, hindsight's 2020, of course, but seeing like the graphical user interface and using the mouse and bitmap graphics and things, it's just such a totally different departure that
the key ingredient, if you wanted to move a graph into a word processor in those days, you had to be well aware of file systems, right? And what I wanted to do in datagramming was really bring an object, whether it's a word processor, spreadsheet, graph, design, artwork, without touching the file system, just cut and paste.
Sure.
And if Xerox didn't have the 7 applications, they had the word processor and I think a drawing package. So, like I said, we had to design applications for the graphical user interface without any APIs. It was only after we had built them that we could define the APIs for someone else to add value.
Right. That's and so that's why Macintosh owes everything to Lisa technology, the Lisa platform, because there would be no Mac if there wasn't that all of like I think the total was like $50 million in R&D to make Lisa.
Yeah.
And so that is just free R&D that went right into the Macintosh.
It was a lot of R&D, but I got to give Steve credit. I mean, Steve and I had, we had a vision. We knew the direction we wanted to go. I've wondered many times if I had backed off and let Steve run the Lisa division, what would have happened. When I worked for him in new products, I used to refer to it as a long-necked organization because I reported to Steve, but everybody reported to me, because Steve was pretty young in those days and could be pretty brutal, to people. I like to say he had a low tolerance for fools. Anybody that tried to BS him, never get away with it. Steve was just too quick and too sharp. And I was fortunate enough that my relationship with Steve grew out of my expertise in computer science, my success, and I had a unique respect. And that's why I wrote the book, by the way, because I felt that everybody was writing books about Steve who didn't know him.
Yeah.
I grew up with him. We were kids, just a lot of stories in that book that have never really been told. And like the day that I walked over to his house, because we both lived in Saratoga, Los Gatos, and Steve was a feng shui type of guy. Everything was perfect, and yet there was a piece of paper on the front lawn I thought looked suspect. And I picked it up. It was an Apple stock certificate for 400 million shares. And I knocked on the door and I said, "Steve, I think this belongs to you." He goes, "Oh yeah, it must have blown out the window." Well, I knew immediately that it wasn't about money for Steve. He told me, he goes, "John, everything I own, the car that I drive, the clothes that I wear, the food that I eat, is from someone else's accomplishment. I want to give something back."
Yeah.
And that it made it exciting to work there because you were not only working for a salary, but you were working to change the world.
Absolutely. And it largely has. I cannot imagine a world. I mean, even the pale knockoffs that this all spawned, the Microsofts and all of that. And I mean, there's a great part in the book talking about like kind of the working with Bill Gates and trying to get like the Office suite and things like that, or Word and all of that.
Well, I can tell you, we was sitting in an executive staff meeting. In those days, there was probably only a dozen maximum, of the top management team. And Steve came in and said, "I just made the greatest deal in the history of mankind," right? And I said, "What's that?" He says, "Bill Gates is going to write my word processor and spreadsheet for $1 a copy." And I said, "Steve, you're a fool." I said, "You just sold the corporate jewels." And I said, "What's the going rate for an application?" 15% royalty. Why do you think he's doing it for $1 a copy? Because now I have to show him the Lisa, which I did in a private room, and I have to give him the first couple Lisas off the manufacturing line. Now, what's ironic is it took us 5 years to launch that plane with no schematic, right?
Yeah.
And $50,000, which we made back in the first year selling them. It took Bill Gates 55 years to duplicate it.
Right.
And he had it sitting there and all the software.
Well, and that's one of the things that I appreciate about the book, John, is it kind of sets the record straight on a couple of these early stories, because people they talk about how it was like movies, even like Pirates of Silicon Valley and stuff, get a lot of those details wrong because they largely kind of ignore the Lisa and just push it straight to the Mac as if that was the first thing out the door.
Yeah, but the team knows, and a lot of our team went over to the Mac.
Mhm.
Quite a few went over to help the Mac. So, like Bruce Daniels, for
Yeah.
instance, Um, but I hired a lot of computer scientists out of Stanford, out of Berkeley, out of MIT,
Mhm.
out of Michigan. So I really feel that the strength that Apple has today in their software really goes back to the original 70 or 80 individuals that we hired.
Yeah.
And
The right people came
we
together
had to hire them
with
without showing it to them. you know?
I think you just had to believe in it. And there's a lot of things like that I do in my life that I do it because I'm like, I know the right people will get this. And it certainly feels like the right people came together to form that initial
Well,
team.
you're only as good as the people you can surround yourself with. So, having graduate degrees in computer science, I knew what to look for.
Mhm.
Um, I never hired a PhD because their world is so different. They're rewarded for individual efforts. But in a corporation like this, one person doesn't build Lisa, one person
Mhm.
doesn't build a Mac, one person doesn't build a phone. It
Right.
takes a team who
Yes.
checks their egos at the door,
Hmm.
And I created banners. I think they're in the book, banners of innovation, and one of them was, know the difference between effort and results,
Yeah.
and the other one was, let's not argue about uh, diamonds and emeralds when the world has coal,
Yes.
you know, and right now the computers are coal, and
Yeah.
whether Lisa turns out to be a diamond or an emerald, it doesn't really matter. Let's
Yeah.
get it out the door.
Yes. Yep. It's gonna lay the foundation, and it certainly did. But with all of that, do you feel that history has been kind to the Lisa? Do you think that
Uh,
it gets the credit that it deserves?
I never thought about it, and it really wasn't the reason we did it. I mean, we really, I think, from a computer science standpoint, it was a huge challenge, and the rewards in the journey, as
Hmm.
Steve would say, and I felt that the journey, the people, the friends that we made, they're still my friends today. They and I love them dearly because they know they were part of something special.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
to be honest, look, think about Apple in those days. We 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 were selling through stores. We
Hmm.
didn't have a direct sales force. We hired 50 people to sell a $10,000 machine. Now, how do you compete with IBM Salesforce when you're trying to sell a $10,000 machine? So
Yeah.
I think we were quite naive when it came to, the personal office systems. But I'm not sure we could have come up with a personal computer that looked like Mac without going through that experience. You
Right.
know, one of the things in my education book, I said one of the things that's wrong with education is we don't let our children fail. You know,
Yeah.
failure, you learn from it and you
Yeah.
move on.
Yeah.
And
That's one of
yeah,
the things as a scout leader. It's you set these youth up for. It's like here's this experience, here's this thing that you're going to work out and do, and there is an opportunity to fail. You don't have a far way to fall, but we're going to be here to support you and
exactly.
build you up and give you that push to achieve. So it's very much it's like the edge where it's like enabling people. It's you mentor, but then you absolutely enable people for success.
Yeah, well, I mean, don't you think that Steve learned something from the Cube or from Next?
Oh
Absolutely.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
Steve that I knew at 29 and the Steve that I knew when I came back at, whatever age it was, 30, 40, 45, were two entirely different Steves.
Oh sure.
One that had really matured,
Hmm.
now, that's not to say he couldn't be brutal. I remember when when I looked at Steve told me, he says, look, John, I need people that will stand up to me. I have too many yes men. And then he said, what was he about? He said, I failed education. I need you to, solve education for me. If you can't solve it, we're getting out of it. And he says, I bet the company on OS 10. I've bet the company on OS 10. And when I looked at the education market, I only had 6% of the computers in K-12 that could run OS 10. I was up a creek without a paddle, as they say. And so I sat around with Phil Schiller and Steve Jobs in a marketing meeting, and I said, what can we do? And we came up with 10 for Teachers, where we would give a free copy of OS 10 to any teacher in North America. And I said, Steve, how many do you think will take us up on this? Because I got to budget my marketing bit, And he said, maybe about 15,000. You know how many teachers took us up for a free copy of OS 10? 500,000.
Yeah.
My whole marketing budget for the first year.
Yeah.
I have got letters that teachers sent to the IT department that said, you made the transition from typewriters to the computers, now OS 10 is the best operating system out there. Quit whining and do your job. That came from a teacher. So we empowered the teachers, Unfortunately, where we lost was I couldn't convince Apple to give free email accounts to teachers. And Google did.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, teachers were familiar with Google. And then the other thing, of course, that happened is Microsoft invested $2.5 billion to on thinking they would get all the testing machines.
Yeah.
And Google comes in with a low-cost machine. And then the schools are going, okay, we got to buy them. We got to do testing. It's mandatory. Now, what do we do with them? Well, let's give them to the teachers because the teachers know email. So, that's one of the challenges I think that we had in education going forward.
Oh yeah, it's a crazy market, and it's weird how things have changed. My employer, we had a one-to-one initiative. We've done a lot of stuff with iPads. I will tell you that that completely changed, made things a lot more accessible for people, just to be able to pick that up and go and have everything right there in your hand, even easier than like a MacBook or something like that.
So here's what I do a lot of work with entrepreneurs, and I lecture out at the Cal Poly here, where I'm in San Luis Obispo. And I said, what do you think made the iPod successful? It wasn't the hardware, it wasn't the software, it was the ecosystem that it operated in, the iTunes infrastructure. And so I'm going to come back to that because I went to Eddie with that. But what made and I asked Steve for an API for the iPod. And he goes, no way, John. He goes, I don't want anybody's software destroying my music, okay? But when the phone came out, okay, what made the phone successful? The App Store.
Yeah.
The fact that okay, and then so when I came out with the iPad, my goal was iTunes U. So I said, look at Eddie, the music industry is paid for an infrastructure that can distribute content all over the world free. And I said, I want every university's courses to be available to those on an iPad.
Yeah. And
so that would have been the ecosystem that would have changed the iPad forever. But Steve was cautious. He goes, I don't want to market it. He goes, I don't want to wake up the sleeping giant in the Northwest.
Yeah.
So we let the universities market it, right? So the fact that Stanford had 100,000 people taking a programming course on iTunes U, and MIT software was up there. After I left, they shut it down, which I always felt was going to be the curriculum that homeschools need, and even schools. Yeah. And when COVID hit, we could have had all of the curriculum easily available. So instead, the schools go out and buy iPads, and yet you can't run the same software, over a electronic line that the teacher has available in the classroom. In other words, the curriculum has to be rewritten for an iPad and distribution, not what exists in the textbook. And so a lot of people bought iPads, and probably for the wrong reasons.
Very possibly. I'm not sure how a lot of instructors would do it without it, though, these days. Like, I mean, it's just so ingrained in people that it's such a tool to be able to just go to a meeting and take notes, or be able to then turn back around, and the whole thing with being able to sort of broadcast the display up to a projector and stuff. Again, it was all very revolutionary when that all came out, which is...
Let me tell you about podcasting, okay?
Oh, yeah, that too.
So, as a team, we went to Philadelphia and took the history walk.
Mm-hmm.
And I recorded the guide, and we took pictures. And I brought it back to the engineering team and said, look, iPods are banned in schools, okay? But if you give me the ability to create a podcast, which I hand-coded, okay, and handed it to them, the podcast of the Liberty Walk.
Mm-hmm.
I said, if you give me an app, I'll get iPods back into the school.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't give me an app. They built it into iMusic,
Mm-hmm.
right? And then I remember getting up in front of my sales team, which is about 800 strong, and saying, I want every one of you to create a podcast this year. And nobody knew what a podcast was. I swear they thought I was absolutely crazy, right? And I said, no, go learn about podcasting, because it's gonna change the distribution of content.
Yeah.
And I still wish I had a podcast app to make it simpler.
Sure. It's but again, it's the other part. Why is it called a podcast? iPod. Right. It's almost, it's just so...
It would have been part of the ecosystem, see?
Mm-hmm.
iTunes, iPod, and the podcasting would have been an ecosystem that you offer. Anyway, it's it was an incredible opportunity to work with Steve, and a great ride. In fact, and I got to work with Steve twice.
Yeah. I was going to say, because you did, there was a point where you had left, you were kind of taking a little bit of a break from that, and you had left to become a board member for the Santa Fe Christian schools.
Yeah, which ended up being running the show for the first couple of years to get it out of debt, and I put a Mac lab in there. What's ironic about it is, when I told Steve I was leaving, Steve had a tendency to treat people that are leaving the company almost like a divorce. We're never getting married again, type of thing, right? You're going to Google, you're going to a place like that. But he told me, he said, John, he goes, I want you to take your business acumen and interject it into the education community. And once you've done that, bring the education acumen back to me.
Mm-hmm.
I did that 10 years later. It's uncanny that Steve saw it, saw exactly that,
mm-hmm.
and called me and said, I want you to come back to Apple. I've failed education. If you can't, and I don't know if it's a marketing problem or a sales problem, but if you can't fix it, we're out of the business.
Yeah.
And we grew it to $10 billion in the next 10 years. Yeah. But Steve was just uncanny in terms of seeing the future.
Oh, yeah.
And not only seeing the future, but knowing when to introduce a product.
Mm-hmm.
You realize that the feature on the phone was actually introduced in the iPod for me, but he decided to introduce the phone first. which I think turned out to be valid because the phone opened up international business that I could then follow with education software.
It's a good foot in the door, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, but I mean, look, we could go on forever because there's so many stories to tell.
Oh yeah.
And it's all part of history. I've got my Apple One.
Oh wow, yeah.
And Wendell Sanders got it up and running for me.
Very nice.
He goes, we could do it the easy way or the hard way. And I go, what's the hard way? He says, we just plug it in and see if it works. And if it doesn't, it blows some of those chips. You can't replace them.
Yeah.
And that was the easy way. Yeah. I said, what's the hard way? He says, we take them out one by one and we put them back one by one. And she did. Yeah. And I have a letter from Wendell Sanders saying, I have the cleanest Apple One board that he's ever seen. And I got it because Steve had 10 of them in his office because they offered an Apple II to people to turn in the Apple Ones. Yeah. So he had a stack. I should have taken them all, but I just took one.
Well, they're certainly a big collector's item these days. There's a couple that will come to VCF Midwest in Chicago, and they have an Apple One and they have it on display. And they don't announce when they're going to be there. They just show up and it's there. And if you'd like to come and take a look at it, you certainly can. And
I've got one that works.
It gets out. Everybody gets over there to look at it.
Yeah. So that's probably the one thing that that I won't sell.
Oh no, I certainly don't blame you.
I will leave it to my son. Well, my son and daughter and my granddaughter are both computer scientists. Hopefully someday we'll have a fourth generation computer scientist, but it'll be a totally different curriculum, right, with AI.
Oh yeah, it's constantly changing. It's been really weird to kind of watch that and kind of supplant. I mean, anything that can be automated will be automated. But at the same time, to kind of watch how we've transformed from this era, and even in my organization, where it used to be about like creativity and kind of like save the checkbook, and it seems like now it's very much shifted to a model of like, let's just throw money at these things to get them done. It's, software as a service for everything that you used to host in-house and stuff. And I think it's just because a lot of that creativity and people wanting
that's an antithesis of one of my, innovation banners, because we say, throw creativity at the problem, not the checkbook, in the early days, but we'll see where things go.
I think that there's always room for expertise. So hopefully we can get to a point where we get enough people that are curious and want to learn and have that initiative to kind of to be the Wazes.
Well, that's the key, curiosity, and education seems to have buried that. One of my favorite quotes was, education is what people do to you. Learning is what you do for yourself. And you got to be willing to fail.
Yeah.
I bought all my grandkids, all the young grandkids, all have Crunch Lab kits.
Oh, yeah.
They're building stuff and, left and right. And the older kids can program it, reprogram it. That's the learning environment. And yet you go into the schools and there's no more music and, everything's. I have a documentary called The Death of Recess that I believe Angel Studios is picking up. And it's a story about how we've been getting rid of recess.
Yeah.
And it's the wrong thing to do. I've started a new company with a young former opera singer called Crescendo Studios, animation and games based on complex music and neuroscience. And it's early childhood to help language development and math skills. And we're really excited about that. We'll be launching that towards the end of the year, working with MIT and a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, you've had such a diverse career. We've talked a lot about Apple and then going and being on the board for a school of education, But I mean, you've been a CEO and stuff as well for like biomedical companies and
Yeah,
cutting
I
edge genetic research and
yeah, it's kind of ironic because it was a company called Pangea Systems in Oakland. And when I came back from my 10 years in San Diego, um, I, I was I don't know, an entrepreneur or an executive in residence at Mayfield. And they had dropped me into a couple companies, the early software companies, really even before the web took off, right? And one of them was this company in Oakland called Pangea Systems. And they were doing contract software. Well, you know, that's not very scalable, right? And so I created an infrastructure there. First of all, I changed the name of Pangea Systems because it didn't mean anything to DoubleTwist. And I created a software platform with software agents. So I had publication agents, literature agents, um, homologous agents, different search agents, and basically democratized genomic research.
Mhm.
We empowered. It was like Yahoo, but for genomic research. So any scientist anywhere in the world could get on our system, submit their sequence, and these agents would go out into the ethos and bring back information on their sequence. And we even went so far as basically what we were saying is the lab is now a computer lab first rather than a bio lab. And we were even able to recommend the different materials that the scientist needed to continue with his search. My son, who was in sophomore in high school, used it for his science project, where he showed that the reason for the default for frogs being found with multiple legs was not ozone layer depletion and ultraviolet light, nor was it pesticides in ponds, but it was a parasite that had buried into the hind leg of the frog, and basically like a terrorist going into the cockpit of an airplane and taking it in a different direction. And,
Yeah.
won the history fair at Bellarmine College Preparatory, which is, 100-year-old plus, Catholic boys' school. Um, and got called from Doug Brutlog at Stanford University. And he said, "How'd you like to spend your summer continuing your research?" And he goes, "No, I play basketball in the summer, But it proved the point that I was trying to make in education, that these students are capable of so much more than
Mhm.
the teacher asks of them. That's why challenge-based learning is we say it's relevant, it's creative, it's collaborative, it's challenging, but the student picks the project because that makes it relevant immediately, and they'll always pick something harder than the teacher because the
Mhm.
teacher teaches to the average. And Todd's book, End of Average, basically says there is no such thing as average, right? It's a great book. He wrote that book at the same time I wrote Rewiring Education. He wrote it from an academic research perspective. I wrote Rewiring Education based on the 10 years that I'd spent at the school and the
Mhm.
18 years that I'd spent running Apple's education business.
Yeah.
And we combined those two, and it calls for a whole new pedagogy, one that's not memorization.
Right.
Um, and that was the number one selling education book in China in 2019. Um, and I did write a follow-up book called System Failure, which I was referring to the failure being the pedagogy. We're still asking kids to memorize. But when COVID hit and the kimono was opened, people saw the failure now more as woke-ish and different agendas. So I didn't want to be involved in that. So I put that back on the shelf, and we wrote a book on AI, like Ripley's Believe It or Not, where we take 30 industries and we show real examples of where AI is modifying and changing those industries.
Yeah.
And now I'm working on my final book called An Ordinary Man's Journey from Awareness to Intimacy, which is a personal spiritual journey. So it parallels the Apple journey. You know,
That's very great. I'll have to read it whenever you publish it.
whenever I get it out. That one's a lot harder to write because you're bearing your soul.
Yeah.
You know, you're telling everybody the failures and your mistakes in your life. But I want my kids to know me as a real, you know, vulnerable person, not just the guy that, you know, was the VP at Apple.
Absolutely. Well, this is a very personal book, too. I feel there's a lot of things in here that is just like your personal recollection and how you saw things and how you internalized those things, and when you needed to step away, that you took time to step away and to try new things, and like you said, to maybe do something and fail at it, or have a chance to fail at it.
Yeah.
That
Well,
for your personal growth.
School was a perfect example of that, because when I started to look into it, it was $360,000 in debt, losing $30,000 a month, and had a 30-day lease on the property. And my first reaction was, "Whoa, what's Steve Jobs and Bill Gates going to think?" You know, when I fail at this effort. But I was convicted to, you know, to put my energy and effort there, and trust a higher power that it was their vision. So, but I've learned a lot. I'll be 78 next month. So, and I love working with college students. Students. They're so smart and so bright, and they just need to be given, you know, like Mike Markley once told me. He says, "You just give people as much rope as possible, but pull it back right before they hang themselves."
Yeah.
You know.
Absolutely. It's being a mentor is such a powerful and important thing. I pray that everybody finds that person in their life that is able to kind of inspire them to be their best version of themselves. I know that not everybody has that kind of support thing, but you just hold out hope.
Well, I have a tasting room for my winery, and it's less of a business and more of a ministry. It's more of an opportunity to help people. I've had 3 people this week alone call me and spend time in trying to navigate some difficult decisions in their lives. So that Apple has opened the doors for me to help people.
I know it's amazing.
Yeah.
So, I wanted to say that just because of your the thing, like after you came back to Apple, and there's all those programs that Apple kind of had over the years for education stuff. Like you've got Kids Can't Wait, and you've got ACOT, so like the
school nights, school nights,
and iTunes U and all that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just amazing all the students, like the impact that this has made on instruction and on students themselves, and how teachers deliver content. Because even if something wasn't, it didn't go all the way, or it didn't get pushed across the line the way you thought it did, it still it just inspired so many other things.
Yeah. Well, it's impacted my family. You know, I have 17 grandkids.
I know.
You know, and so I have my own petri dish when it comes to education. So, and I do a lot with Cal Poly now that I'm here in San Luis, and they have, you know, a pedagogy called Learn by Doing.
Yeah.
And the kids do everything. They make milk, ice cream, you know, beef, wine, you name it. And it's really easy to hire a student out of Cal Poly because they know their business.
Yeah. Actually, I read your like the welcome letter that they'd kind of put online to introduce you to people in the community, and it was a very interesting read, and it's very complimentary, of course, but it's also a great thing to kind of like cover like your career and what your expertise is, and kind of your view on learning and that mentorship and all that. It's
I don't even know if I've read that.
Oh, really? It's only like 6 paragraphs, but it's just
maybe it came because they gave me an honorary doctorate this year. Maybe that's where it came.
Maybe so.
but it was fun to be able to graduate and talk to the students, the graduates, because when I graduated at Berkeley, it was during the Vietnam War, and we didn't walk. You know, we were just give me the degree and let me get out of here.
Yeah.
So, hey, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, if you want to do round 2 sometime, you know, just let me know.
Absolutely.
Maybe do one on education.
Yeah, absolutely. Get that book out. We need to talk about that too. So
Yeah, well, you got 2 of them out there right now, so
yes,
we'll live with those. But
okay.
you know, I've got them all here in the wine tasting room. I give them out free to people. I've even got my, I think it's in the book, my offer letter from Steve.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, it is.
posted in
You did a
here,
really
yeah.
great job of kind of recreating some of those memos and stuff that went around.
Yeah.
Like I guess where Mike Scott was like, everybody get rid of your typewriters. We're a
Yeah,
technology company.
There'll
Yeah.
be no more typewriters.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, it was an interesting time. Yeah.
It was.
So,
John, thank you so much. I want to make sure one more time, I just want to plug the book, My Life at Apple and the Steve I Knew. Definitely pick up a copy, maybe go by the winery. Maybe John will give you a free copy.
yeah, there you go.
Nothing else, pick up a copy online, pick it up at your local library. It's a great read. It's breezy, especially if you love this topic like I do. It took me 3 days to just kind of like zip through and take my notes and everything for the interview. So.
Hey, John Scully did it in one afternoon.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I think John's retired though. I think he's got a couple more extra hours in the day.
I'm sure he does. Okay, sir. Thank you.
John, thank you so much. Have a
Appreciate
wonderful
it.
evening, sir.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I can move that over, and you
John,
see
I
a
have
pie
to,
chart.
I have to interrupt. I know you said it took you 3 years to figure this out, and I gave you 3 minutes to explain it.
It's okay.
However, coming up in just a minute, we're going to take a look at Vision, another version of integrated software, and that'll be next.